It seems like almost every week brings fresh headlines about Ukraine striking, Russian targets in occupied Crimea, and this week is no exception. But those strikes aren't random. Ukraine is running a long game, a deliberate, patient two-pronged strategy aimed not just at winning battles, but at undoing Russia's hold on the peninsula. Stick around, we'll lay out how those strikes fit into a clever plan that could, over time, force the Russian presence out of Crimea. Start with the recent strikes. On September 9th, Ukraine's main intelligence Directorate HUR reported special forces destroyed 2 Russian radar systems in Crimea, the Podlet and the Nebo-M. HUR timed the strikes right around Military Intelligence Day, and the Nebo-M was reportedly hit while it was on the move, a technically demanding operation. A few days earlier on September 1, Ukrainian intelligence struck at Vardiska Air Base, destroying 2 Mi-8 helicopters, each worth $20-30 million, and also knocked out a Buk 2190 tugboat tied to Russian naval sabotage units. These losses aren't just tactical, they're expensive. That price tag is central to Ukraine's calculus. Look for patterns. Ukraine conducts concentrated bursts of attacks, multiple, high-value targets taken out in a single wave, then pauses. After a few days or weeks, another burst follows. Those pauses aren't accidental. They let Russia repair or replace what was lost. And that's the whole point, forcing Russia to sink cash, labor, and time into rebuilding assets that Ukraine will strike again. Because Crimea is politically and symbolically priceless to Moscow, the Kremlin feels compelled to keep pouring resources into defending and restoring it. Ukraine is exploiting that compulsion. There's another practical aim behind many of the strikes, blinding Russia's air defenses, rather than always trying to destroy S-300s and S-400s head-on, a risky approach that can lose drones and personnel. Ukraine often targets the radar nodes those systems depend on. Remove or degrade the radars, and the air defenses can't detect or lock on to incoming low-altitude drones and small aircraft. That creates windows of opportunity for follow-on strikes using platforms that otherwise would be vulnerable. Evidence of this approach is visible in the reappearance of the Bayraktar drone. Once an early icon of Ukraine's drone campaign, Bayraktars had been sidelined because Russian air defenses and electronic warfare made them especially vulnerable. But as Ukrainian strikes stripped away radar coverage, Bayraktars and other strike drones re-emerged and scored important hits, including the destruction of a fast Russian naval vessel near the Tendrivska Spit that reportedly killed and wounded members of an airborne unit. In short, take out the eyes, then use drones to hit high-value targets with less risk. That's the immediate, kinetic layer of the campaign. The strategic layer is subtler and longer term. Geopolitical analyst Paul Warburg argues, Ukraine is pursuing a two-pronged strategy to make Crimea unsustainable for Russia. First, bait Russia into making expensive, repetitive mistakes by exploiting the Kremlin's psychological attachment to Crimea. Since 2014, Moscow has treated the peninsula as a sacred piece of national patrimony. Public messaging like Krimnash, Crimea is ours, and Putin's own rhetoric underscore that. After the annexation, Russia deliberately resettled large numbers of ethnic Russians into Crimea, reshaping the peninsula's demographics. That move both tightened Russia's grip and created a humanitarian pretext Putin could exploit if Ukraine attempted a direct reconquest. Because of that, a full frontal land assault is effectively off the table. Crimea is almost an island connected to the mainland by a narrow land bridge. Any large-scale ground invasion would funnel troops through predictable choke points, the Kerch area in the east, and the narrow western approaches, making the invasion highly vulnerable to prepared defenses, mines, long-range fires, and attrition. It would invite catastrophic casualties and a propaganda storm about civilian losses, which is precisely what Russia hopes would deter Ukraine. So Ukraine's plan isn't a direct storming of Crimea. Instead, Warburg says, Ukraine is waging 2 complementary pressures. The first is financial and psychological attrition. Hit expensive military assets, force Russia to rebuild, then hit them again. The repeated cycle of damage and repair bleeds the Russian budget and diverts resources from other fronts. Consider how much Russia has already spent subsidizing Crimea since 2014. Billions of federal funds and state-owned investments on, and then add The daily cost of the wider war. Every destroyed radar, helicopter, or naval vessel compels more spending on repairs, fortifications, and maintenance. Over time, this becomes unsustainable. The second prong is population pressure. Leave an escape route and create fear. Ukraine is careful not to eliminate Moscow's only lifeline out of Crimea. The Kerch Strait Bridge, for instance, has been attacked before and certainly can be damaged further. There are claims Ukraine could deploy heavier munitions like the Flamingo missile family in the future, but Kyiv has incentives not to entirely sever that route. Why? Because the bridge serves as a visible, vulnerable lifeline. Repeated attacks and the looming threat of its destruction create a climate of insecurity for Russians settled in Crimea. If those residents start doubting the Kremlin's ability to protect them, they're likelier to leave on their own. Mass departures would undercut the demographic and political basis Putin spent a decade building. Put those prongs together and a coherent strategy emerges. Force Russia to choose between spending to prop up a politically prized but militarily exposed territory, or diverting those funds to more pressing war needs, all while making the civilian Russian population in Crimea feel unsafe enough to consider leaving without Kyiv firing a shot at civilians. Ukraine's strikes are the lever. The pauses and signaling are the repeatable mechanism that amplifies the pressure. There are trade-offs. This approach is slow. It depends on the Kremlin's inability or unwillingness to continue throwing money and manpower at Crimea indefinitely. It also assumes that continued pressure will convince enough settlers to leave, or that Moscow's economy will be sufficiently strained to force a reallocation of resources away from Crimea. None of that happens overnight, but Ukraine's leadership appears willing to play the long game, accepting incremental gains that compound into strategic advantage. On the tactical side, Ukraine's approach has already had practical effects. Degraded radar coverage, increased freedom of action for strike drones, and tangible losses for Russian forces and assets in the Black Sea and on the peninsula. On the strategic side, the repeated attacks followed by pauses function as an economic and psychological squeeze. Kyiv is essentially turning Crimea into a costly quagmire for Moscow, while simultaneously preserving an escape option that could encourage depopulation rather than provoke a humanitarian catastrophe. If Ukraine can keep up the pressure, continuing the cycle of strikes, pauses, and targeted signaling, Warburg's argument goes, the combination of financial strain and civilian flight could gradually undo Russia's control without a catastrophic amphibious or ground invasion. It's a patient, surgical sort of warfare. Degrade defenses, exploit the opening, force Russia to waste resources, and erode the social and political foundations of the occupation. That's the story unfolding now. Tactical strikes that create operational space for drones and more attacks, stitched into a strategic campaign designed to make Crimea politically and economically untenable for Russia. It's a long, careful strategy built around the psychology of possession, the economics of repair, and the military realities of a narrow, fortified peninsula. If you want to follow developments closely, subscribe and watch the feeds from Ukraine's intelligence and defense channels. They often provide the first alerts about new strikes and their reported effects. For now, Ukraine's approach is incremental but clever. Hit hard, step back, make Moscow fix it. Then hit again, and in the gaps, make the people who were moved to Crimea by Moscow think twice about staying. Over time, that could change the map without a single catastrophic land assault.